In the autumn of 1903, a woman vanished from a farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania without leaving a single footprint in the frost. Her name was Eleanor Gareth. She was 34 years old, a schoolteacher, a widow, a mother of 2 young daughters, and according to every record that survived her, tax documents, census forms, church ledgers, she had lived an unremarkable life in the hills outside a town called Coldwell. But the night she disappeared, something changed in that house. The farmhouse still stands today, though barely. Its clapboard walls are grey with age, the windows long since shattered by wind and neglect. If you walk the dirt road that leads to it, past the overgrown apple orchard and the collapsed barn, you can still see the shape of her world. Modest, isolated, bordered by woods on 3 sides and silence on all 4. Eleanor had moved there in the spring of 1901, 2 years after her husband, Thomas Gareth, died in a mill accident. She had no family left in Philadelphia, where they'd lived before. So she took what little money remained and bought the farm. Cheap, remote, far enough from town that people rarely visited. She homeschooled her daughters there, kept chickens, sold eggs and preserves at the market on Saturdays. Neighbors described her as quiet, polite, private, the kind of woman who answered when spoken to but never lingered. She kept to herself, wrote Constable William Brenner in his official report dated November 14, 1903. No known disputes, no debts, no trouble with the law. But on the morning of November 12th, her daughters, Clara, age 9, and Beatrice, age 6, were found alone in the house, wrapped in blankets by the cold stove, the door wide open to the November wind. Eleanor was gone. The bed was made. The kitchen was clean. Her coat hung on its peg. Her boots sat beside the door. A pot of soup, still faintly warm when the constable arrived, rested on the stove, as if she'd planned to return any moment. But she never did. For weeks, search parties combed the surrounding woods. They dragged the nearby creek. They questioned every farmer, peddler, and traveler within 20 miles. No one had seen her. No one had heard anything. No struggle, no scream, no sign of violence. And yet, there was something. A detail so small that Constable Brenner nearly omitted it from his report. A single line, written in pencil at the bottom of page 4. The younger girl, Beatrice, when asked where her mother had gone, said only, "She heard it again." When pressed, the child would not explain. And Clara, the elder daughter, said nothing at all. She didn't speak for 3 months after that night. Not to the constable, not to the neighbors who took them in, not even to her sister. The records show that both girls were eventually placed with an aunt in Ohio. Eleanor's property was sold at auction in 1905. The case was never solved. The file, thin and faded, now rests in a storage room in the basement of the county courthouse, marked unresolved, presumed dead. But presumed is not the same as known. And in the margins of Brenner's notes, beside the description of the open door and the cooling soup, someone, perhaps the constable himself, had written a single word in ink: listening. To understand what happened that night, you must first understand the silence that came before it. Eleanor Gareth had not always been a quiet woman. In Philadelphia, before Thomas died, she had been a schoolteacher at a small parish school near Rittenhouse Square. Former colleagues remembered her as articulate, patient, good with children. She had a soft voice, they said, but it carried well in a classroom. She read aloud to her students every Friday, poetry mostly, Wordsworth, Tennyson. She believed in the power of language. But after the accident, after Thomas was crushed beneath a collapsed beam at the textile mill where he worked, something in her withdrew. The funeral was small. The insurance payout was smaller. Within 6 months, she had sold their narrow row house and moved the girls to Coldwell, to a place where no one knew her name or her grief. The farmhouse had belonged to a man named Virgil Tate, a widower who had died the previous winter. It came with 12 acres, a well, a chicken coop, and a view of the ridgeline that turned gold every October. Eleanor paid $215 for it, everything she had left. At first, the neighbors tried to help. A woman named Ruth Calloway brought over a basket of bread and preserves the day Eleanor arrived. Another farmer, Jacob Morse, offered to repair the barn roof in exchange for some of her land. Eleanor thanked them politely, declined the offer, kept the bread. She wasn't unfriendly, Ruth Calloway told the constable weeks after the disappearance, but she didn't invite conversation. You'd see her at the market, selling eggs, and she'd nod, say good morning, count her coins, and leave. She never asked how anyone was, never told you how she was. Still, there were no complaints. The girls were clean, well-fed, well-behaved. Clara helped her mother with the chickens. Beatrice, the youngest, spent hours in the orchard, talking to herself, building little houses out of sticks and stones. That child had an imagination, Ruth said, always singing to herself, making up stories. Eleanor homeschooled them using books she'd brought from Philadelphia, mathematics, grammar, history. In the evenings, she read to them by lamplight, the same way she had once read to her students. The neighbors could sometimes see the glow of the lamp through the window as they passed by on the road. But over time, that light appeared less and less. By the summer of 1903, Eleanor had begun to change. Jacob Morse noticed it first. He'd been hauling timber past her property one afternoon in late July when he saw her standing at the edge of the woods, motionless, staring into the trees. He called out to her. She didn't respond. He called again. Nothing. Finally, he climbed down from his cart and approached her. "Mrs. Gareth?" She turned slowly as if waking from a dream. "Are you all right?" She looked at him for a long moment, her face pale, her hands clenched at her sides. "I thought I heard something," she said quietly. "Heard what?" She didn't answer, just shook her head and walked back toward the house. Morse mentioned it to his wife that evening. She told Ruth Calloway. Ruth told the postmaster. By autumn, it had become a known thing. Eleanor Gareth was acting strange. She stopped coming to the market as often. When she did come, she seemed distracted, glancing over her shoulder, speaking in half sentences. Once, she asked the postmaster if anyone had been asking about her. He said no. She nodded and left without buying anything. Clara later told the constable that her mother had begun waking in the night. She would sit by the window, Clara whispered during her brief testimony, recorded in Brenner's notes. Just sitting, looking out, sometimes for hours. "Did she say why?" Brenner asked. Clara shook her head. "Did she seem frightened?" "No," Clara said. "She seemed waiting." On the evening of November 10th, 2 nights before Eleanor disappeared, Ruth Calloway's husband, Daniel, was returning from town after dark. The road passed close to the Gareth property. As he neared the house, he saw a light moving in the orchard. A lantern. Eleanor was standing among the apple trees, holding the lantern high, turning in slow circles as if searching for something. Daniel stopped his horse and watched. She stood there for nearly 10 minutes, silent, still, the light swaying gently in her hand. Then she blew out the flame, and in the darkness, Daniel Calloway swore he heard her speak, though there was no one else there. "I know," she said. November 11th, 1903. The last full day Eleanor Gareth was seen alive. The weather had turned cold. The first frost of the season had come 2 nights before, coating the grass in silver and hardening the mud along the road. By mid-morning, the sky was low and colorless, the kind of sky that makes the world feel smaller, quieter, pressed down under gray weight. Eleanor was seen twice that day. The first time was just after dawn. A man named Thomas Ridley, a tinker who traveled the rural routes selling pots and tools, passed the Gareth property on his way toward town. He later told Constable Brenner that he saw Eleanor standing in the yard near the well, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "She wasn't doing anything," Ridley said, "just standing, staring at the woods." He raised his hand in greeting. She didn't wave back, didn't acknowledge him at all. "I thought maybe she hadn't seen me," Ridley said. But her eyes were open. She was looking right in my direction. He didn't stop. Something about the way she stood there, so still, so fixed, unsettled him. He urged his horse forward and continued into town. The second sighting came in the early afternoon. Ruth Calloway had walked over to the Gareth farm with a jar of apple butter. She'd been meaning to check on Eleanor for days, ever since her husband mentioned seeing the lantern in the orchard. When Ruth arrived, she found the front door closed but unlocked. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Then she heard Clara's voice from inside. "Mama's resting." Ruth opened the door slightly and peered in. Clara was sitting at the table with Beatrice, both girls working on arithmetic slates. The house was dim. The stove was cold. "Is your mother unwell?" Ruth asked. Clara shook her head. "She's just tired." "Can I speak with her?" "She said she doesn't want to be disturbed." Ruth hesitated. She could see the closed door to Eleanor's small bedroom at the back of the house. She considered pressing further, but something in Clara's tone, flat, rehearsed, made her stop. "All right," Ruth said quietly. "Tell her I brought this for you." She set the jar on the table and left. Years later, Ruth would tell her daughter that she regretted not insisting, that she should have opened that door, that she should have known. But how could she have known? What happened next is reconstructed from the testimony of the two girls, given separately in the days following their mother's disappearance. Their accounts are brief, fragmented, and in Beatrice's case, nearly incoherent. But together, they form the only record of Eleanor Gareth's final hours. The evening began normally. Eleanor emerged from her room just before dusk. She lit the stove. She made soup, potatoes, onions, a bit of salt pork. She set the table. She spoke very little, but that was not unusual. Clara and Beatrice ate in silence, as they often did. After supper, Eleanor washed the dishes while the girls sat by the stove. Clara read aloud from a primer. Beatrice played with a corn husk doll she'd made. Then, around 8 o'clock, Eleanor stopped. She was standing at the window looking out into the dark. "Mama," Clara said. Eleanor didn't respond. Clara stood and approached her. "Mama, what is it?" Eleanor's hand was pressed flat against the glass. Her breath fogged the window. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Clara listened. She heard nothing. The wind, the creak of the house, nothing else. "Hear what?" Eleanor turned to her. Her face, Clara said, was very pale. Her eyes were wide, but not with fear, with something else, something Clara couldn't name. "It's calling," Eleanor said softly. "What's calling?" Eleanor didn't answer. She reached for her shawl, draped over the back of a chair, and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Mama, where are you going?" "I need to see." "See what?" Eleanor looked down at Clara. For a moment her expression softened. She touched Clara's cheek. "Stay inside," she said. "Both of you. Don't open the door no matter what." "Mama, promise me." Clara nodded, her throat tight. Eleanor kissed the top of her head. Then she kissed Beatrice, who had begun to cry softly, though she didn't know why. "It's all right," Eleanor whispered. "I'll be right back." She opened the door. The cold rushed in, and Eleanor Gareth stepped out into the November night. Clara stood at the window and watched her mother walk across the yard toward the tree line. She was carrying the lantern, just as Daniel Calloway had seen her do 2 nights before. The light swayed as she walked, casting long shadows on the frost. Eleanor reached the edge of the woods and stopped. She stood there completely still, the lantern raised high. Then she turned, just once, and looked back at the house. Clara would later say that her mother's face in that moment looked peaceful. She wasn't scared, Clara told the constable. She looked ready. Eleanor turned back toward the trees and walked into the darkness. The light grew smaller, smaller, and then it was gone. Clara waited at the window for hours. Beatrice fell asleep by the stove. The house grew colder. The soup, forgotten on the stove, stopped steaming. At some point, Clara opened the door and called out into the night. "Mama?" No answer. She called again. Nothing. The woods were silent. She closed the door, locked it, wrapped herself and Beatrice in blankets, and waited. When Constable Brenner arrived the next morning, summoned by Ruth Calloway, the lantern was found 30 yards into the woods, resting upright on the ground, the oil burned out. There were no footprints leading away from it, no broken branches, no sign of struggle, just the lantern and silence. By noon on November 12th, the entire town of Coldwell knew that Eleanor Gareth was missing. Constable William Brenner arrived at the farmhouse just after 10 o'clock that morning. accompanied by Ruth Calloway and her husband, Daniel. Ruth had come by at dawn to check on the family and found the girls alone. The door still locked from the inside, the house cold and silent. Brenner's first action was to interview Clara. The girl was calm, unnervingly so, and recounted the previous night's events with a clarity that unsettled him. He wrote every word in his notebook, underlined certain phrases twice. "It's calling." She looked ready. Beatrice, when questioned, could only repeat one sentence over and over. She heard it again. "Heard what?" Brenner asked gently. Beatrice wouldn't say. She began to cry, and Ruth took her into the other room. By early afternoon, a search party had been assembled. 15 men from town and the surrounding farms, armed with lanterns, rifles, and dogs. They began at the tree line where Eleanor had last been seen and moved methodically into the woods. The forest beyond the Gareth property was dense, old-growth timber mixed with thick underbrush. In places, the canopy was so thick that even at midday, the light barely reached the ground. The men called Eleanor's name as they walked. Their voices echoed back, hollow and strange. They found the lantern within the first hour. It sat upright on a bed of dry leaves, as if someone had carefully placed it there. The oil reservoir was empty. The wick was cold. But what struck Brenner most was the ground around it. The frost from the previous night was still visible in patches throughout the woods. But around the lantern, in a rough circle perhaps 6 feet wide, the ground was clear. Not melted, not disturbed. Just clear. As if the frost had never formed there at all. Jacob Morse, who had joined the search, crouched down and studied the earth. "No prints," he said quietly. Brenner knelt beside him. Morse was right. There were no footprints leading to the lantern, no footprints leading away. "She had to have walked here," Brenner said. "We know she carried this lantern into the woods." "Then where did she go?" No one had an answer. The search continued for 3 more days. They covered nearly 40 square miles of forest, fields, and creek beds. They questioned every person within a day's travel. A peddler, a family of migrants passing through, a hermit who lived in a shack near the ridge. No one had seen Eleanor. No one had heard anything unusual. On the 4th day, the search was called off. In the weeks that followed, theories spread through Coldwell like frost. Some believed Eleanor had run away, that the isolation, the grief, the weight of raising 2 daughters alone had broken her, and she'd simply walked into the woods to die. But that theory didn't explain the lantern, or the missing footprints, or the fact that she'd left her coat and boots behind. Others whispered darker things. There was talk of foul play, a drifter perhaps, someone passing through who had noticed the lonely widow living alone with her children. But there was no evidence of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, and Clara's testimony was clear. Her mother had left willingly. A few of the older residents mentioned the woods themselves. "People have gone missing in those trees before," said a man named Silas Jepson, a logger who'd worked the area for 30 years. He told Brenner about a trapper who'd vanished in the winter of 1887, and before that, a young girl, sometime in the 1860s. Both had walked into the forest and never come back. "It's old land," Jepson said. "Some places just take people." Brenner dismissed it as superstition, but he wrote it down anyway. The most disturbing testimony came from a neighbor named Peter Halford, who lived a mile east of the Gareth property. He came forward nearly 2 weeks after Eleanor's disappearance, reluctant to speak, convinced no one would believe him. "I heard something," he told Brenner, "the night she went missing." "What did you hear?" Halford shifted uncomfortably. "A sound, out in the woods. It was past midnight. I was up because one of my cows was calving. I stepped outside for air and I heard it." "Describe it." "It was like singing, but not quite. More like humming. Low and steady, it carried on the wind." "Could it have been an animal?" "No," Halford said firmly. "It wasn't an animal." "A person, then?" Halford hesitated. "Maybe, but it didn't sound... I don't know how to explain it. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. From the trees, from the ground." Brenner stared at him. "Did you investigate?" "No," Halford admitted. "I went back inside, locked the door." "How long did it last?" 10 minutes. Maybe more. Then it stopped. all at once, and the woods went completely quiet. No wind, no animals, nothing. Brenner closed his notebook. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Halford looked down at his hands. "Because I thought you'd think I was crazy." In early December, Clara and Beatrice were sent to live with their aunt in Ohio. The farmhouse was boarded up. Eleanor's few possessions were packed into crates and stored in Ruth Calloway's attic. But before the girls left, Constable Brenner spoke to Clara one last time. "Is there anything else you remember?" he asked gently. "Anything your mother said? Anything that might help us understand?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked up at him, her face pale and serious. "She'd been hearing it for weeks," Clara said softly. "Hearing what?" "She never told me, but at night she would sit by the window and listen, and sometimes she would cry, not loud, just quietly, like she was sad, or scared, or both." "Did you ever hear it?" Clara shook her head. "No, only her. And that last night, when she said it was calling, did she seem afraid?" Clara thought about it. Then she said something that Brenner underlined 3 times in his report. "No," Clara said. "She seemed like she'd been waiting for it." The case file was officially closed in March of 1904. Cause, unknown. Status, presumed dead. But in the margins of his final report, Constable Brenner added a single handwritten note. Something in those woods knew her name. 73 years later, in the spring of 1976, a researcher named Dr. Margaret Hale traveled to Coldwell, Pennsylvania, to compile a regional history of unsolved disappearances in rural Appalachia. She found Eleanor Gareth's name in the county archives, buried in a file cabinet that hadn't been opened in decades. The case intrigued her, not because it was unusual. People vanished all the time in those years, lost to accidents, illness, violence, or simple despair, but because of what had been left behind. The absence of evidence, the precision of the testimony, the silence. Dr. Hale tracked down Clara Gareth, now Clara Brennan, 73 years old, living in a nursing home in Columbus, Ohio. Clara's memory was still sharp. Her voice was soft but steady. And when Dr. Hale asked her about that night in 1903, Clara closed her eyes and recited the details as if they had happened yesterday. "I've thought about it my whole life," Clara said quietly. "What she heard, where she went, why she left us." "Do you have a theory?" Dr. Hale asked. Clara was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I think she heard something that was meant only for her." "What do you mean?" I think whatever called to her that night had been calling for a long time. Maybe since we moved there. Maybe even before, and I think, eventually, she couldn't ignore it anymore." "Do you think she wanted to leave?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know, but I know she wasn't taken. She chose to go. I saw her walk into those woods. I saw her face. She wasn't running. She wasn't afraid. She was answering." Dr. Hale leaned forward. "Answering what?" Clara shook her head. "I'll never know." Dr. Hale also spoke with Beatrice Landon, 70 years old, living in Michigan. But Beatrice remembered very little. The trauma had fractured her memory. She recalled the cold, the waiting, her mother's face in the lamplight. But when asked about what her mother had heard, Beatrice only shook her head. "I used to hear things too," she said softly. "When I was a child, at night, I'd hear something outside, like someone calling, but I could never make out the words." "Did you tell anyone?" "I told Clara once. She said I was dreaming." "Do you still hear it?" Beatrice looked out the window of her small apartment. Beyond the glass, the street was quiet, ordinary, full of parked cars and trimmed lawns. "No," she said, "not anymore. It stopped after we left that place." She paused, then added almost as an afterthought, "I think it only wanted her." In the summer of 1976, Dr. Hale visited the site of the old Gareth farmhouse. It was nearly gone. The roof had collapsed decades earlier. The walls leaned inward, held together by ivy and rot. The orchard had grown wild, the apple trees gnarled and twisted, their branches heavy with small, bitter fruit that no one picked. The woods beyond were unchanged. Dr. Hale walked to the tree line where Eleanor had last been seen. She stood there for a long time, listening. The wind moved through the branches. Birds called in the distance. Somewhere a stream trickled over stones. But there was something else. A quality to the silence. A weight, as if the forest were holding its breath. Dr. Hale later wrote in her field notes, "I can't explain it, but standing there, I understood why someone might walk into those trees and not come back. Not because they were forced, but because they heard something the rest of us couldn't. Because the silence wasn't empty. It was full." She never returned to the site. Eleanor Gareth's case remains unsolved. Her body was never found. No new evidence ever surfaced. The file, thin and yellowed, still sits in the basement of the county courthouse, marked in fading ink, unresolved. But over the years, others have gone looking. Hikers, curiosity seekers, researchers like Dr. Hale. Most find nothing. A few claim to have heard something. A low hum, a distant voice, a sound like wind through a hollow. But when they try to follow it, the sound moves, fades, disappears. In 1983, a journalist named Paul Hendricks spent 3 nights camping near the site, hoping to experience what Eleanor might have heard. He recorded hours of audio. When he played it back, there was nothing unusual. Just wind, just crickets, just the ordinary sounds of the night. But on the second tape, buried beneath the static, there was a brief moment, less than 5 seconds, where something else appeared. A voice, faint, almost imperceptible. Calling a name. Hendricks couldn't make out the words. He sent the tape to an audio forensics lab. They analyzed it for weeks. Their conclusion, inconclusive. The sound could have been wind, or distant traffic, or an artifact of the recording equipment, or something else. Hendricks never published the story. There are no memorials for Eleanor Gareth, no headstone, no plaque, no marker in the town cemetery. Her daughters lived long lives, raised families, grew old. They rarely spoke of their mother. When they did, it was always in the same way. With sadness, yes, but also with a quiet, unspoken understanding. Clara Brennan passed away in 1994 at the age of 91. In her final days, she told her granddaughter a story she had never shared with anyone else. "The last thing my mother said to me," Clara whispered, her voice thin as paper, wasn't, "I'll be right back." That's what I told the constable. That's what everyone remembers. But that wasn't the last thing. Her granddaughter leaned closer. "What did she say?" Clara closed her eyes. She said, "I've been waiting to hear my name again. The farmhouse is gone now. The land was sold, cleared, replanted. A new family lives there. They know nothing of Eleanor Gareth. They've never heard anything strange. The woods are just woods. But sometimes on cold November nights, when the frost comes early and the sky presses low and grey, people passing by on the old dirt road say they see a light. A lantern moving slowly through the trees. It never comes close. It never stays long. But it's there, waiting, listening, and somewhere, in the silence between the wind and the darkness, a voice still calls. Not to us, to someone who already answered.